One. Good morning. Welcome to Weather Insights Tropical Briefing for Sunday, July 13th, 2025. I'm meteorologist Scott Pitney along with meteorologist Jeff Lindner. Jeff, we have something to talk about in the Gulf for the coming week. National Hurricane Center is expecting that area right there off the coast, off the Carolinas, to drift toward the west, kind of a southwest direction, and then take sort of a western trajectory as it moves across the Gulf. And similar to the situation we had in the Atlantic, where we had kind of an elongated trough and we had some spin, and eventually a tropical storm developed from that one. Kind of a similar setup, but there are some differences. And I know you're going to talk about that in a minute. But right now, 7 day outlook is calling for a 20% chance of development. Again, right now, just looking for a trough of low pressure to develop along the U.S. coast. And either way, it'll likely bring heavy rain to potentially heavy rain to the southern Gulf Coast states, possibly all the way over into Texas. A little bit too early to tell, but definitely something we need to keep an eye on for the upcoming week.
Yeah, it's a very similar setup to what we had last week. Well, the July 4th weekend here in this area of the country, the this
Mm.
kind of trough axis here, an old decaying frontal boundary. And interestingly enough, the same thing going on here in Texas as was going on the July 4th weekend. Very heavy rain again in the Texas Hill Country overnight and flooding going on several of the rivers. And so the pattern almost repeating itself. And I've kind of said this over and over again. Once you get in these summer patterns, they don't tend to change a whole lot. And so we're kind of seeing a very wet summer playing out in Texas and this kind of in close potential for tropical development here. Very kind of favored area so far off the southeast U.S. coast and into the northern Gulf of Mexico. And I'll step you through the ensembles again. At this range, you don't really like to look at the individual deterministic models. You kind of like to look at the ensemble approach in modeling. There's not a real big signal here on the ensembles. You can see there's a couple members here, and this is for Friday or Thursday evening this week, Thursday, this upcoming week in the evening. You can see there's a few hits here off the southeast Louisiana coast. That's European. This is the GFS, maybe a few more down here in the north central Gulf of Mexico and the Canadian, a few more. You know, what's interesting is this kind of hugs the Gulf Coast, and so that's going to be an important factor. If we see any development with this as it comes across Florida and moves to the west, you know, how far south into the Gulf does it move? The further south it moves, the better chances maybe that we'll see some development with this if it stays a little bit closer to the coast. Obviously, land interaction could keep that from forming, and so we'll just have to see kind of a west or northwest motion here eventually in the Gulf of Mexico. So right now, kind of looking like a threat to the north central Gulf Coast, say from southeast, south central Louisiana on over to the Mississippi, Alabama, maybe Florida Panhandle area as we get late this week. So we're talking Thursday, Friday, Saturday of this week. And this is the European probabilities for a tropical cyclone to form. So this includes a tropical depression. And you can see these probabilities now 30 to 40% here in the
Mm.
north central Gulf of Mexico for later this week of at least a tropical depression forming. So I think those hurricane center probabilities are going to start creeping up here a little bit as we get into later today and tomorrow. If we continue to see the support here from the models. And then lastly, like you mentioned, you know, the legacy of this may actually go down as to the heavy rainfall. This is going to be a slow moving system, maybe at times kind of meandering, potentially relatively disorganized. And these types of systems are notorious for producing a lot of heavy rain and the potential flooding. So initially here in Florida, early midweek, we're going to have a lot of rainfall as it gets on the eastern side of this. And then we're going to have to start paying attention here along the U.S. Gulf Coast from the Florida Panhandle, Mississippi, Alabama into Louisiana as to where we expect some of those heavier rains to develop as we get late in the week and into next weekend. And could this spread a little bit further west? It is possible. We'll just have to see where exactly, like I mentioned, where exactly any surface low forms and then exactly how it tracks. And so there's quite a bit of uncertainty with this, obviously, before anything forms. Second being, this looks like a relatively disorganized system. And then finally, the steering currents are not very well defined. They're actually going to be pretty weak. And so that could potentially allow some meandering and erratic motion of this here in the north central Gulf of Mexico along the Gulf Coast. And so this is something, like you said, we're going to have to at least keep an eye on. If you have vacations planned over here, definitely something to keep an eye on for later this weekend into next weekend, especially on that heavy rain and potentially leading into a flash flood or flooding type event here somewhere along the U.S. Gulf Coast and maybe even into Florida here early to midweek.
Yeah, so like we always say, stay in tune with trusted sources like Weather Insights. If something does develop in the Gulf, we'll increase our frequency of these briefings. So make sure you're subscribed to our YouTube channel. Make sure you turn on those notifications. And also a reminder to check out our website. We're now having daily forecasts on our Weather Insights social media platforms. And we have Jeff's blog on the Weather Insights website. Jeff, thank you very much.